Thank you very much, Kathy, for that kind introduction. And thank you for inviting Anka and me here today to speak about, basically to speak about culture and cultural heritage. This is, you may have seen this quote. Anka uses it sometimes, has used it on her pods, and it's something very much we believe in. It's from the visionary Viennese architect, artist, and preservationist Frederick Hundebussel. So we're talking about cultural heritage and how it relates to sustainability and a sense of place. And I'd like to provide some examples of that, and then if you'll indulge us, I'd like to talk a little bit about the project that Anka and I just completed, which I think, and hope anyway, is a good illustration of the term cultural heritage. Next. Just in case, for those of you who don't know what the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario is, the ACO was founded in 1933 to advocate the protection and conservation of Ontario's architectural and landscape heritage. We do this through advocacy, through education, and through a newsletter, and sometimes deputations to council. There's about 25 branches across the province now, and our branch was formed in, I believe, 2006. Unlike the Heritage Committee, which is generally limited to advising council on issues, heritage issues, the ACO is more free to be vocal and organize concerned citizens and generally speak out publicly on an issue. We're a volunteer group. We have charitable status, and we're member-based, so we're always looking for concerned citizens to join. Next. So the definition of cultural heritage is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations, which I think is a great definition. So we're not only concerned about the preservation of a particularly ornate or unique or grand building, but also about the buildings that have that intangible attribute, something that society values, perhaps provides a collective memory, or places an important role in an area's development, or simply tells an interesting story of the past. And also want to touch on cultural heritage landscapes, which I think is very important. A defined geographical area of heritage significance, which has been modified by human activities and is valued by the community. And of course, the best example of cultural heritage landscape is our own downtown Heritage Conservation District. A collection of 1860s to 1920 buildings where the collection is greater than any individual building, and where every building in that collection is very important in maintaining the whole. And of course, just outside the door here on Elgin Street, that's an amazing cultural heritage landscape. It's probably in my mind, one of the nicest streets in Hollywood. Beautiful churches, grand churches, beautiful brick homes, majestic trees. The loss of any one of those would greatly devalue the entire landscape. This, of course, goes without saying, but I think we don't think enough about the landscape nature of heritage preservation and how it affects our sense of place. So I have this up here because I think, since we're talking about cultural heritage, we have to learn from our losses. And what better example of the definition of cultural heritage than the old and lamented Admiral Columbus School, or former CCI. You can make a very convincing argument, and we did, that it has a lot of architecture, it had a lot of architectural merit or physical attributes, 1920s Georgian architecture, but even more so, its cultural importance, the intangibles associated with the former school. What is more culturally important than a building where a large part, or even a majority of the town, went to school at some point in their young lives? This is something, of course, that has a huge impact on everyone's development. Perhaps it's where you learned to read, or where you played a part in a school play, or where you had your first crush, or you were inspired by a particular teacher or subject. So when a building like this goes down, it's not just the architectural loss to the streetscape, but also equally a loss to our collective memory and sense of place. So this is, I think, an issue you're going to hear a little bit more about in the near future. The former Connaught School, or the former East Ward School, now the Contact Centre. It's a rare example of a 19th century school building, and also a fine example of cultural heritage. Built in 1884 and operating as a school until 1969, the Connaught School building is one of only 2 intact 19th century school buildings remaining in Collingwood. The property is now protected as a result partly of the efforts of the Heritage Committee and the Architectural Conservancy, protected by heritage designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. It's architecturally important. The building was designed by well-known Collingwood architect Marshall Ainsworth in the Romanesque Revival style of architecture. Mr. Ainsworth was a highly accomplished architect and a one-time chairman of the Ontario Association of Architects. I think what's also interesting about this building is how it relates to the neighborhood. It's an integral part of a Victorian neighborhood. The building is not an isolated building, but part of the heritage landscape. The residences of the neighborhood form an almost uninterrupted heritage landscape of buildings from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. The Connaught School building, as it does, sitting on a geographical high point of the area, also is the dominant landmark structure. In other words, it works as a cultural heritage landscape. Recently, I've had a chance to have a couple of really good looks at the interior of the building, and it is truly in pristine condition in terms of that it's never been altered, that it is therefore very much a walk back in time. The building's trim work, grand staircases, and beautiful tin ceilings, and even the blackboards remain in place. So, turning to now the downtown heritage district itself. The term sense of place, I've mentioned that a couple times. Sense of place is used to refer to the feelings that people have for a particular location and the meaning they gain from a relationship with these places. There was a recent British study, actually in 2009, a very comprehensive study, that conclusively demonstrated that the historic environment has a positive relationship on how people feel about where they live, or in other words, their sense of place. The research shows that people living in areas with a higher concentration of historic environment are likely to have a stronger sense of place. What does that mean? People identify with where they live. It creates greater self-esteem, improved sense of well-being, and makes for a stronger and better local decision-making. And an historical environment leads to a greater social capital. We see this in the renaissance that is now taking place in our own heritage environment. Yes, some of that is a result of various levels of government making improvements such as the recent streetscape work, but much of it is the result of investment by property owners and businesses in the form of improvements to their facades and also to their interiors, uncovering their tin ceilings, their moldings, and making improvements as well to the second floor units. As a matter of fact, these second and third floors themselves represent tremendous potential. We heard a little bit about this last week when Don spoke about this issue, about housing. But unfortunately, this is not always recognized, as we know, by the building owners. Anke and I have seen this for ourselves. Because of improvements that we've made to our properties, maintaining their heritage characters, we've been able to attract excellent tenants. Particularly, second and third floor apartments have attracted young professionals who love the lofty feel, the vintage look of the living space. Most recently, second floor office space has been filled with a couple of small media-related businesses which have moved from more modern space on the edge of town into the heritage district. Why? It's simply because of the sense of space. The heritage character, the closed-in space created by the building facades and streetscape, the walkability, and the close access to the area's cafes and restaurants combine in a landscape that is a vastly superior place to live and work. So I'd like to turn a little bit to the Tremont now. I think one of the questions that Anka and I got asked the most is why would you take on this project considering the condition of the building and the investment required? And I think simply it was because the building had an important story to tell. An important story to tell about our past. This is a picture probably late 1920s by a photograph was taken by Teresa Armitage's family, and she actually lives across the street and grew up in the Tremont. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Tremont was built in 1889 by John McCormack as a 24-room hotel. And it's one of the last remaining 19th century hotel buildings in the Collingwood Heritage District. This is a great picture because we use this picture actually quite a bit in order for us to be able to recreate some of the elements of the building that had been lost over the 120 years, particularly the chimneys. Each one of these chimneys here was at one point a working chimney, and every one of the 24 rooms had some source of heat. And but they had been lost over the years, as had the most of the parapets. Next. So why is it an important heritage landscape? Well, it's the proximity of the hotel to the former railway station that made it a popular destination for travelers. Erected during the active building period after the 1881 fire that devastated a large part of the downtown, the building occupied an important location between the railway and the Palace Livery, which is now gone, the current location of the library. The building's typical brickwork of the late 1800s has many interesting embellishments. And it is simply a classic example of probably the best example sort of an unaltered 3-story standalone hotel that we have in the district. Of course, the building has a lot of cultural value. It's because it tells the story about the link to our railway and shipbuilding era. It was operated as a hotel for over 100 years and still carries its original name. And it was at one time one of 16 hotels that we had in the downtown. And when we were doing the work and we were outside in the building and painting, and we had so many people come up to us and tell us their connection to the Tremont, their stories, whether they were former shipyard workers who enjoyed coming on their payday and spending some time at the Tremont. It's just an endless number of interesting stories and connections. So this is just, wanted to put this up. This is a painting by Jason Alexander, an artist rendering that he prepared before we really started work to give us an idea of where we were kind of going with the building. So the starting point, this is where we started off, June 2009. As you can see, the parapets at that point, of course, were long gone, the chimneys were long gone. The building was covered with several coats of paint, and the main floor had been basically bricked in sort of a 1970s facade, hiding a lot of the original windows, as well as just really destroying the symmetry of the building. During the removal of the old Starlight Lounge, which was the one-story addition, as well as some of the staircases in the back, a lot of damage happened. I don't think there was any long-term thinking in terms of saving the building at that time. And so we had quite the challenge repairing some of the damage. Actually, it was the first thing we had to take care of because it was a structural issue. And again, here we are, we're working away, we're fixing up some of those holes. Some people ask us, why do you have those bricks? Why did you paint the bricks in the back? Well, all the bricks that you see on the back wall that is not painted were actually bricks that we had, those were areas we had to fill in, gaps and holes in the building. We just decided we were going to leave them unpainted since we had spent so much time removing paint already from the building. The back wall of the building is not painted because the condition of the brick was just too bad and to actually be able to clean the paint off. So here is the process, and we're removing now the facade brick, revealing the original windows. We were quite fortunate that there was very little damage behind that brick. Again, there's John Caustic removing the brick. A little bit of a before and after picture. That's John's crew, who worked very hard. While we started working, filling the gaps on the outside of the building, they were gutting the interior. The interior had been basically rebuilt sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. Not very well in terms of, they had raised the floors, they had lowered the ceilings. It wasn't a very pleasant place to live, so we simply gutted the building entirely. Again, an example of some of the brickwork that we had to repair. This is an area that had been chopped away in order for them to put in that 70s brick. And go to the next picture. You can see the repair work being done to that. We were lucky to have some very, very excellent craftspeople work on the building who were able to replace brick and do this kind of work. And unless you knew it was done, you really wouldn't be able to tell. A lot of the brick we had to we probably sourced the brick from a dozen different homes around town. We went, Tonka and I and Bowie went as far as Coldwater to collect bricks from old buildings that we used to rebuild the facades. So this now, we're on to the challenging process of removing the paint. It's a process that the company from Toronto did this work that they suggested would take about 5 weeks. It ended up taking about 3 months. I think they were kind of learning, it was a learning process for them as well, but essentially the process meant putting a paint remover paste, environmentally friendly product, onto the paint, covering it with the plastic, letting it sit for ended up being about 15 hours was ideal, and then peeling it off, and then it was a process of scraping and using some water pressure as well to finish the cleaning. So it was a very, very slow process. You can see again. Go back one. So here we're about halfway through the process. This side has had the paint cleaned off, but it still has all that environmental staining on it, and I think that was the reason they obviously painted the building originally. And of course that came about from years and years of exposure to coal dust from the adjacent rail yards and from the shipyards, and of course from the building's own chimneys, and really blackened the brick and taken the color away from it. The rest of that was basically cleaned through the use of a very gentle acid wash, which cleaned it up in a few applications of that. Section just being having the paint removed. Okay. So the rebuilding of the parapets was one of the major costs associated with the exterior of the building. I think we had to replace about 12 or so courses of brick and then rebuild the chimneys to their original proportions. And you can see the process. And again, this photograph is what we were working towards, and that's the result we got. So it was absolutely valuable to have that photograph. Okay. Of course, we had to replace the roof. It had never been replaced in 120 years, so it was quite a thick and heavy process of removing the old roof. It was very important to Anglican and I that we did this restoration as historically correct as we could. So we obviously decided we weren't going to use vinyl windows, we were going to use just all wood windows. They weren't going to be pre-painted, we were going to paint them ourselves to the colors that we were actually able to match having found some of the old window frames, we were able to match the colors that would have originally been on the building. And so we put in the 2/2 heritage hung, single hung windows and spent some time getting the right colors. Just before and after picture. This was a sign that we had found. Actually, these two signs. One you'll see on the back of the building. This is the smaller version. Both these signs were up in the attic space. They're beautiful gold leaf signs that were in great condition. If you know this gentleman, Steve Redmond, he was kind enough to do a little restoration work on it, but they were fabulous signs, and they're 120 years old. It's exactly the type of sign you would have seen in a lot of the old pictures. You'll see the exact same type and sign on many different buildings. So we're quite pleased that we were able to put that up again. This is Teresa Armitage and Nora, right? And just a great story. I don't really have time to go into it, but these ladies grew up. They had their childhood in Fremont when their parents bought the building in around 1930. They spent 20 plus years in the building. Their parents eventually sold the building. It went through various hands. Teresa moved over here to Elgin Street, and during our grand opening, it was the first time they actually came back to the building. And I guess, how long was the absence? 60 years they hadn't been in the building, even though they lived just around the corner from it. And it was just so wonderful to have them in the building, and they walked through the building remembering where their bedrooms were, and what they were telling stories about how they would throw snowballs to the neighbors across the street, and it was just really nice to have them in there. So today, the building is open now. It's an interesting mix of tenants in the building. Anka can tell you that we've had great demand for the space. Much of it is arts and culture related. The Bay School of Art, which is running classes most of the day, and always has some activity going on. It was one of the locations for Wordstock, and is also part of the Gaslight Tour. The second floor, there are 9 artist studios. There's always, you'll usually find at least a few artists at work. The building is open to the general public, so you can wander up and you can see the art in the foyer and in the second floor hall gallery. And you can peek into the various studios. The third floor contains 4 apartments. We're just finishing that up. Because it was very important to us that we at least return some residential space to that location. The Fremont Cafe, everybody wonders when it's opening. It's probably going to be opening in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And here's some pictures of the, this is one studio, this is the art school. This picture on the top left is part of the cafe. It's actually a separate room. It's called the Inuit Book Room. And the current owners, so the owners of the cafe actually have a connection to Collingwood history, where Wispy, her great-great-grandfather, was a former mayor of Collingwood and a very noted surveyor. So they've named that room after him. Louis Stewart was his name. Next. And that was from the grand opening. And one more picture. So we were just amazed by the tremendous outpouring of public support we had at the grand opening. There was probably about 600 to 800 people that turned out and toured the building during the 3 hours of the grand opening. It was a testament to the fact that this was truly a community effort. It was a project that involved scores of people and organizations that spanned probably about 5 years. First, to save the building from the wrecking ball, and then the dozens of workers and many craftsmen required to restore it. So again, why was it important to Anka and I and the many people involved? It's because of cultural heritage. The architecture was important, yes, but also the intangibles. It's about where we came from and where we are going, and about who we are and our sense of